Hi everyone, and welcome to another crime and punishment story. This week I am covering the story of Thomas Dixon and the murder of Alexander McLaren and Joseph Anderson in Jarrow 1896. I did not previously know about this case. I found out about it from a comment on another of my videos and thought that it looked like something I would like to research and write about, so I hope you will enjoy it. But before we begin, can I just say, if you do enjoy this video, then please give it a thumbs up. And if you are new here or haven't already done so, then please do consider subscribing to the channel to help support the content we create. Thank you. There is very little information about the earlier life of Thomas Dixon. At the time of the crime, he was said to be around 21 years old and a labourer at Palmer Steelworks. He was unmarried and lived in Caledonian Road in Jarrow with his mother. In December of 1895 he had been arrested and bound over to keep the peace and fined 11 shillings. This had been because of a fight he had had with Alexander McLaren, who he worked with, and it was stated by some who knew him that since this he had vowed to get even with Alexander. Alexander McLaren, one of the victims, was born in around 1864 and was around 32 years old in 1896. He was the first of the victims to die and had been identified by a Robert Swan, who lodged with Alexander's mother in Wester Road, or this could be Western Road. Alexander died at around 10:25 a.m. on Sunday the 19th of January at the Memorial Hospital. It was said that he was an only son and supported his mother. Joseph Anderson, the second victim to die, was born in around 1874 in Jarrow to parents Jane and Alexander and was around 21 years old in 1896. He worked as a brass finisher and lived with his mother at Monkton Terrace. He had died, I believe, at his home on Sunday night, January the 19th. This case also includes several other victims whose names will be mentioned later in this story. The night of January the 18th, 1896 started like any other night in the town of Jarrow. Many people were in the local public houses enjoying a drink or two. Other people were just going about their business, some out for walks and some on their way home from a night out or from work. Things were, it seemed, the same at the Lord Nelson Inn on Walter Street. Two men had been drinking together and talking in what appeared to be a friendly manner. Both of the men were perhaps a little worse for the drink, but did not appear to those around them to be in a bad or irritated mood. The two men were Alexander McLaren and Thomas Dixon. A little after 10 p.m, Alexander came out of the pub and leaned back against the wall. Close behind him came Thomas. Alexander appeared to need the support of the wall, and to anyone watching it looked like he slid down the wall a little bit. Thomas, who was standing beside him, suddenly took a revolver from his coat pocket, aimed it at Alexander and fired once, hitting him at close range in the chest. Alexander clutched at his chest and fell to the ground. Thomas quickly ran back inside the pub. His attack on Alexander had been witnessed by a David Glass and an unnamed policeman who had also been outside of the Lord Nelson at the time. They both quickly followed him inside. However, the pub was quite busy. Some reports suggest upwards of 40 people were still inside at the time, and they were unable to see him. Somehow he managed to get back outside without being caught by leaving by a different door to the one he had entered, then going into Ormond Street. It was after this that his night of crime began in earnest. Thomas headed in the direction of the cemetery in Jarrow and what was and still is known as Cemetery Road. As he headed to this area, he shot at another two men. Both of these men, Mr. Brewis and Robert Smith, were seriously injured. He had also fired at two women, but these shots had luckily missed them. And on the Cemetery Road he came into contact with Joseph Anderson, who was out walking with his girlfriend Margaret. On seeing the couple, Thomas immediately shot at Joseph, the shot hitting him in the chin or neck area. and after Joseph fell to the ground, Thomas ran away. A very short time later, Thomas came upon a man by the name of Mr. Shand. I have called him Mr. Shand as several articles give his name as George and others as James. He had been sitting on a seat in the cemetery road with Ellen Lambert. They had both heard the sound of gunshots just a few moments earlier. Thomas had suddenly come running towards them, pointed the revolver at Mr. Shand and fired. Luckily for Mr. Shand, the gun was now empty. He immediately jumped up and attempted to take the gun from Thomas. The pair struggled for a few moments, with Mr. Shand knocking him to the ground at one point. Thomas then ran off in the direction of the cemetery entrance, leaving the gun behind. Mr. Shand took the gun to the police station. On his way there, he came across Joseph Anderson, and he helped him to his home, which was quite close by. The police had been aware of the situation from when the first shot had been fired, and after the information from Mr. Shand, Superintendent Fleming was able to set a trap to catch Thomas by positioning police officers in several different locations around the area where he had last been seen, which was no doubt a lot safer for them once they were aware that he no longer had the gun. He was caught quite soon after Mr. Shand had seen him and was arrested for unlawfully wounding. At the time of his arrest, all of his victims were still alive. However, this would quickly change, and the charge became one of willful murder, with both Alexander and Joseph dying several hours after Thomas's initial arrest. At the inquest, which was held at Jarrow Police Court into the death of Alexander McLaren and Joseph Anderson, it was stated that proof had been found that on the 18th of January, just a few hours before Thomas started his shooting spree, he had been to South Shields and bought the revolver for 6 shillings, and he had also bought 50 cartridges. Mr. Stephen of Tyneside Clothing Store, Station Road, South Shields, said that he had sold Thomas the revolver and that he believed him to be perfectly sober at the time. At this, Thomas had asked, "If I was perfectly sober, then I would surely remember buying the revolver, but I know nothing of it." David Glass spoke of seeing a man fire a gun at Alexander McLaren and how he had followed him into the pub. He also spoke of coming back out of the Lord Nelson Inn to find several people carrying Alexander to the Memorial Hospital, where he had later died. He was asked if he knew either of the men, and he stated that he knew Thomas a little by sight, but that he knew Alexander very well. However, he said he could not be sure that Thomas was the man he had seen that night, nor could he say for sure if Thomas had been sober at the time. He said he had not heard any bad words pass between the two men prior to Thomas firing the shot. Dr. Bradley, the police surgeon, said he had visited Alexander at the Memorial Hospital on the 18th. He said he was in a very poor condition. He had examined him, but he had been unable to find the bullet. He had returned the next morning, just prior to his death, and said he was no better when he visited him between 9 and 10 a.m, and that he had died at around 10:25 a.m. Afterwards, he had performed the post-mortem and found the bullet had passed through the lung and was lodged in the muscle of his shoulder. He believed internal bleeding to be the cause of death. Robert Anderson, who worked at the Ben Lomond Hotel in Jarrow, said he was the brother of Joseph. He had said he had spoken to his brother prior to his death, and he told him that he did not know the man who shot him, had never seen him before, and said that due to it being dark at the time, he had not seen him well enough, so he would not have been able to identify him. The inquest was adjourned until the following day, and when it resumed, a short discussion took place concerning a letter that was to be sent to the government in regard to the sale of firearms. It was hoped that the current indiscriminate sale of weapons could be changed. The letter was in direct consequence of the actions of Thomas Dixon. It would, however, be 1903 before the Pistols Act, an act to regulate the sale and use of pistols or other firearms, came into force. Further evidence was given at the inquest into the other shootings that had taken place on the night of the 18th of January. Thomas Thompson said he had been with two other men by the names of Smith and Riley on the Paper Mill Road when a man had come towards them. He said he could not identify Thomas as the man, but he did appear to be of a similar height. He heard a shot, and after the man ran past, he realised that Smith had been shot in the shoulder. Just moments later, he heard another shot, and on reaching the cemetery road, he found Brewis, who was bleeding from a wound near his mouth. John Riley repeated this same evidence. However, he was more sure that Thomas was the man he had seen that night. Mr. Brewis, who at one point had been unexpected to live but had luckily made a good recovery, stated that he was a cartman and lived at Springwell Paper Mills. He was heading in the direction of his home down Cemetery Bank, also known as Cemetery Road, when he saw a strange man walking quickly towards him. He said the man went behind one of the pillars at the bottom of the road and put his arm out from behind the pillar and shot at him. However, it would also seem from further remarks made by Mr. Brewis that the man had stepped out, as he said he seemed to be trying to pull the collar of his coat over his face at the same time. Mr. Brewis stated he had been shot in the cheek and that the bullet was still in his cheek and he could feel it in there. He said he had been dazed by the shot but did see the man running away. However, he was not able to identify him as being Thomas Dixon. He also stated that he had previously heard other shots being fired that night. Sarah Lowther and Rebecca Alexander stated that they were sure that Thomas was the man who had fired at them both on the cemetery road. They were lucky that the shots had missed them. Margaret Collins, girlfriend of Joseph Anderson, said that the couple had been walking on Cemetery Road when she noticed a man coming towards them. She did not know who he was. She said he had crossed to their side of the road, and as he got close to them, she saw a flash and heard a gunshot, and Joseph immediately fell to the ground. She was asked if Thomas had ran away after this, and she said he had, and she did not recall seeing a gun in his hand as he was running away. Ellen Lambert said she had been sitting on a bench with Mr. Shand in Cemetery Road when Thomas had come up to them. She had previously heard the sound of shots fired. She said that Thomas had immediately pointed the gun at Mr. Shand and pulled the trigger. When it did not fire, she said Mr. Shand had quickly jumped up and taken the gun from him. Thomas had then ran towards the entrance of the cemetery. She said she had been very much afraid but had taken a good look at the man, and when she saw him several days later at the police station, she was able to identify him as being Thomas Dixon. Although it is not stated clearly, Joseph Anderson was said to have died due to the gunshot wounds he received in the area of his chin, neck or spine, as some articles suggest different wounds. But I did not find any post-mortem details for him. It was said at one point that a post-mortem had not yet been performed, so the details may not have been reported after the inquest ended. The jury at the inquest quickly returned a verdict of wilful murder against Thomas Dixon, and he was committed for trial at the next assizes. On February the 3rd, prior to the trial, Thomas was moved from Jarrow Police Station to Durham Prison. From the early morning, a large crowd gathered in the High Street in the hope of catching a glimpse of Thomas as he left. However, a rumour began to circulate that he would not be moved until the following morning. By around 5 p.m, people began to believe that the rumour was true, and so by 6 p.m, they had all left. At a little after 6 p.m, Thomas was taken away. He was seen by no one apart from a small boy at the train station who did recognise him. He did not see any of his relatives before leaving, but he did not seem bothered by this. It was said he only expressed a wish to say goodbye to his chum, who was described as someone who he used to keep company with. The trial took place in early March at the Durham Assizes before Mr. Justice Lawrence. As was often the case of murders of more than one person, although Thomas was charged with 2 murders, he would only be tried for the death of Alexander McLaren. Thomas was apparently the subject of much discussion when he took his place in the dock. It was felt that he looked much younger than his 21 years, and it seems many in the courtroom found his age hard to believe. On being asked how he pleaded, he firmly stated not guilty. Thomas was still claiming to know nothing about what had happened on the night of the 18th of January. Many of the men who had been in the Lord Nelson Inn on the night of the shooting gave evidence. John Baird said he had seen both Thomas and Alexander arrive a little earlier in the evening. He said that Alexander had ordered 2 beers, but the barman had said he thought they had had enough already. He said he noticed Thomas take a revolver from his jacket pocket, look at it, and then put it back into his pocket. There are some reports that suggest that this part of the story took place in the county hotel. I wanted to mention this as often old newspaper reports do differ in their recounting of the trial. John Wormsley and Hugh Catney gave similar evidence. However, they believed they had heard Thomas say he had a good mind to shoot them, but they thought that he was only joking. Hugh Catney also went on to say that when the 2 men were outside the Lord Nelson Inn, Thomas had said to Alexander, "I will shoot you," and he claimed that Alexander had replied, saying, "Go on then." David Glass gave the same evidence as he had done at the inquest. Several men testified to seeing Thomas run back into the pub and go out of another door and then onto Ormond Street. Rebecca Alexander said that she was walking on the cemetery road with her friend Sarah. They saw a man coming towards them. She said he pointed the gun at them, and she said, "Hold on, Hinny, don't shoot any more till we gan past." They did pass him, and she said she heard the sound of gunshots and felt something whiz past her head. It was not until later that she heard 2 people had been killed. Her friend Sarah told a similar story, and both said they were still sure the man that they saw that night was Thomas Dixon. It does seem a little strange to me that you would ask a man pointing a gun at you not to shoot until you had gone past. Thomas Thompson, Margaret Collins, Brewis and Mr. Shand all gave the same evidence they had given at the inquest. P.C. Blackett stated that Thomas had been arrested and there had been quite a struggle. He said Thomas had said, "If you think you are going to lock me up, it will take all your time." He also said, "If you are looking for a revolver, you won't find one." However, it was said that Thomas had 38 cartridges in his possession when he was arrested. Dr. Bradley said he had examined Thomas Dixon just after the murders and again on February the 27th. He felt that he was of sound mind. When cross-examined, he said he had no special experience of mental disorders other than his 25 years' experience as a doctor. Dr. Gilbert, the prison doctor at Durham, said he had kept Thomas under observation since February the 3rd. He had also examined him, and he too believed him to be of sound mind. The defence took a very different view as to the state of mind of Thomas Dixon. He felt there had been no expert witnesses to state that he was of sound mind, and in his opinion he was not. In fact, he went as far as to say he felt that on the night of the 18th of January, Thomas had been stark staring mad. He said it was for the jury to decide if they believed that Thomas had not known what he was doing that night. He himself felt there was no better case for insanity than this one. The judge, in summing up, spoke along very similar lines to that of the defence, stating that the jury must decide if they thought Thomas knew what he was doing was actually wrong. The jury took only 7 minutes before returning a verdict of guilty of wilful murder against Thomas Dixon. When asked if he had anything to say, he replied by simply saying, "All I have got to say is that I know nothing about the thing that I am charged with." The judge made a point of stating that not only was he guilty of the murder of Alexander McLaren, but also of that of Joseph Anderson. He then sentenced Thomas to death by hanging, and that his remains would be buried within the grounds of Durham Prison. Thomas was said to stare somewhat vacantly round the courtroom before being removed from the dock and returned to prison, and the date for the execution was set for March the 24th, 1896. Although there had been no recommendation for mercy, it was thought that a reprieve on account of Thomas's young age would be sought immediately. A petition was indeed quickly started asking for a reprieve until the state of mind of Thomas Dixon could be fully examined. It was felt that he had been suffering from homicidal mania, which in simple terms is an irrational desire to kill someone. It was also said that he was not very well educated, though it's not clear how they felt this could have caused him to kill. Another thing that was mentioned was that his grandfather had taken his own life some time ago, suggesting in their eyes that this could have some link to the state of mind of Thomas Dixon. Many places in Jarrow, such as several of the banks and the Mechanics' Institute, would have copies of the petition available for people to sign. I did not, however, find any details of how many people actually did sign it. On March the 19th, a letter was received from the Home Secretary, Sir Matthew White Ridley, granting a reprieve and that the sentence for Thomas Dixon would now be one of life imprisonment. On April the 13th, 1896, Thomas was taken to Wakefield Prison, where it is said that he would serve the first 9 months of his sentence. On arriving at the station, he had to wait some time for the train to arrive, and it was said a small crowd had gathered, and on entering the actual station, Thomas appeared to be affected by the crowd, attempting to lower his head as if trying not to be seen. I did find details for a Thomas Dixon in both 1901 and 1911. In 1901 he was in prison in Devon, and in 1911 he was in prison in Durham. Of course, these men may not be the same Thomas of this story, but both were described as general labourers, were in prison for murder, so it is possible. I did not find any death details for Thomas Dixon. This is an incredibly sad story. There seems to be very little motive or sense to the crime of shooting so many random people. If we are to believe that Thomas wanted revenge for the fight in 1895 with Alexander McLaren, for which the one that he had been fined, then what reason did he have to go on to shoot Joseph Anderson, Robert Smith and Brewis, men he did not even know? And even more confusing, why did he attempt to shoot 2 passing women? In my eyes, I can only see a case of a man who, either with or without drink, had clearly lost his mind that night, in 1896, when he roamed round the streets of Jarrow, shooting anyone he passed. Robert Smith and Brewis were the lucky ones. They both survived, but Joseph and Alexander both lost their lives at such young ages, for what seemed to be no reason at all. Do let me know your thoughts about this story in the comments below. I do hope that you have found this very sad and tragic story interesting. I do thank you all very much for watching, and please do forgive my very many mistakes, and I hope to see you all again very soon.